is Dave Phillips. We're here at TPI, and today we're talking about Jon Rahm's golf swing. Now, Jon Rahm is one of those young phenoms that's kind of hit the scene this year. So this is somebody that is, I think, here to stay. Now, we've been fortunate at TPI to work with Jon for quite some time. He's been coming here for the past 5 or 6 years with the Spanish Golf Federation, and he already had a great, powerful golf swing when he came here. So all we've done is we've gotten to learn from Jon, modify a couple things, and make sure he's on the right track, and he's doing an awesome job. Now, here's a couple of things with Jon that are kind of unique. When we physically tested Jon, he's not the most flexible guy in the world, but what he does is he uses what he has extremely well. So he has a fairly short golf swing. So if we're going to take a look at Jon's golf swing, from the setup position, he's got kind of a standard setup type position. As he takes the club back, you're going to notice he sets this wrist, and it's this left wrist that is probably the most unique part of what he does. It's kind of like Dustin Johnson, but in miniature. Dustin swings the club very high, has a lot of bow in that lead wrist as well. But what Jon does is he uses what he has. He's not the most flexible in the world, but when he turns back, he sets that club, keeps it nice and short. So for guys that aren't that flexible, as a golf professional, I'm always looking for them to keep the swing in check. If he tried to have this long swing or get his arms up in the air like a Dustin Johnson, he would probably come out of his posture a little bit. So what he does so well is he keeps his body angles, keeps the club nicely out in front of the body, and this is what I love. As he starts down and uses his lower body, he gets his arms down in front of his body beautifully. So from the face-on position, he goes here, short, wide backswing, uses the ground in his lower body beautifully. The arms get down in front of his body. So I always love players that are able to maintain this angle, this relationship between the shaft and their lead arm past this trail leg. And he does this beautifully. And then as he starts to straighten his lead leg, the handle rises. Now here's a young man that hits the ball a long way. He's about 175 to 76 ball speed, which is very fast. Clubhead speed in the 117 to 120 miles an hour. He generates plenty of speed to be out there for a long time. He has a simple swing. I don't see any flaws in his golf game. He's got a great attitude, and I think you're going to see a lot more from Jon to come. So let's go to the 3D bay with Greg, and let's look at where Jon really gets his power from. I think you're going to be amazed at what we show you.
Hey guys, this is Dr. Greg Rose at TPI. I want to talk to you about one of our favorite young golfers out there, Jon Rahm from Spain. We've had the pleasure of working with Jon here at TPI for over 6 years now. We've seen him when he was a little kid with part of the Spanish Federation and watched him bloom into one of the best players out there on the PGA Tour. And lately, since he's been performing so well, a lot of people have been asking questions about how he develops so much power, especially a short backswing. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the details on, maybe highlight some of the ways that he does generate power. And this may be something you can do to help you or your students out there. So let's take a look at some of the details. And to me, the answer to his power is in the details here. First and foremost, I think we talk a lot about at TPI, generating power. It's like a rubber band. Muscles are like rubber bands. They can create elastic energy. If you take a rubber band, you pull it back, you can create this elastic energy. It's the same way your muscles work. So if I want to get a lot of power from my torso, I'm going to try and load the muscles that rotate my torso, which are my abdominals, my oblique abdominals specifically. So that's why you see a lot of players trying to create this separation between their upper body and their lower body. Now most players, if you take them to the top of their backswing, their hips rotate around 45 degrees and their shoulders rotate around 90 degrees. So they have this separation of 45 degrees. Imagine they're pulling it back 45 degrees, the rubber band. People look at Jon and they go, man, he's got a really short backswing. He must not be getting 45 degrees, and therefore, how does he generate all this power? Well, I want to show you some of the data. So if I take a look at Jon's 3D data here, and I'm going to actually take him to the top of his backswing, and I'm going to show you a couple things. First and foremost, if I pull up this graph, this red line here represents rotation of the lower body. So I can actually see how much he's rotating his hips. And at the top of the backswing, he's literally getting around 28 degrees at the top of the backswing. He actually has a little bit more than that. He actually, right before the top of the backswing, he can almost get around 30 to 34 degrees. So somewhere between 28 and 34 degrees is how much his hips turn. But I told you on PGA Tour, the average is around 45. So he's literally got 10 to 15 degrees less hip turn than most players. Now, if I take a look at his upper body, let's see what his upper body's doing. And Okay, if I look at his upper body is turning around 78 degrees. Again, it's not the 90 that we see with a lot of players. We see players go over 100 degrees. But if your hips are turning 28 degrees and your torso is turning 78 degrees, guess what? The amount you're separating is still more than the average PGA Tour player. The average PGA Tour player separates around 45 degrees. Jon is consistently 48 to 50 degrees of separation. He just doesn't turn all of his parts a lot, but he does separate and create that coil, which I think, number one, is very important for creating maximal power. I think that's important to understand. It's like in a rubber band, people think, well, it's how far do I pull the rubber band back? If I take the rubber band and I do this and I move them all together, that's still not going to create any elastic energy. It's how I separate the two. So whether I do it like this or I do it like this, I can still create that elastic energy. A second piece to creating power is where you load the muscles and which muscles you load. So we're talking about separating the upper body from the lower body. Well, there's a couple other areas in your body that you can actually generate power from. So you can generate power not only from the core, you can generate power from the arms. So in other words, I can load the shoulder joint and I can load the wrist joint. And one of the things that 3D technology allows us to do is it allows us to what I call follow the power. We can actually look to see where you generate speed and which part of your body is contributing to more power. And the way we do that is we look at a graph called the kinematic sequence graph, which we've talked a lot about at TPI. And here's a great graph of Jon's. And one of the ways to, first of all, determine which part of the body is creating power is we look at the interaction between the adjacent segments. In other words, I always like to look to see how much the upper body is separating from the lower body. And to be able to see that, the red line on a kinematic sequence graph represents the pelvis of the lower body. And what the kinematic sequence graph is doing is it's looking at acceleration. It's looking at its speed. It's actually angular speed, how fast the lower body is rotating. So if I look at Jon, right here, he starts his lower body on the downswing. So you can kind of see it, and I'll kind of blow this up in his swing. He basically is starting his downswing with his lower body going first. So whenever the lower body goes first, the upper body is still going backwards. You're starting to create that stretch between the upper body and the lower body. When I look at Jon, the way he does this, you can see his lower body, which is the red line, is on top of his green line, which anytime the red line's on top of the green line, the hips are moving faster than the torso, so therefore you're creating this separation or this stretch because the hips are going faster. And if I actually look at the space between those and I add up that space, it's a mathematical trick we call integration that can actually tell me how many degrees he's doing. And like I told you, Jon separates a lot. He gets about 50 degrees of separation between his upper body and his lower body. So I look at him and I see a big separation between his upper body and his lower body. Instead of looking at the upper body and the lower body, if I start to look at the shoulder, if I look at the green line compared to the blue line, the green line is his torso, and it shows me when his torso is accelerating, but his arm's not. So if his torso is accelerating and his arm's staying back, he's now loading the shoulder joint. And if I look at this graph on him, he does that a little. So he has a separation in the shoulder. It stretches like the rubber band, and I'd say compared to his lower body, it's like 1/5 of his lower body. So his shoulder contributes to the power, but his core contributes way more. So if I look at his core is creating this huge separation, his shoulder is creating a mild separation. But if I take it one step further and I look at the wrist and how he uses the club, one of Jon's very unique characteristics is his wrist. And you'll see he is very much like a Tom Lehman or a Dustin Johnson, very bowed at the top and always has his wrist bowed. And if it gets too bowed, he tends to have problems. If he keeps that under control, then you see what he does, he plays really, really well. Well, there's actually power you can generate from the wrist as well. And we look at that power by looking at how fast the hand is moving or the arm is moving in relationship to the club. So think about this. If the arm's moving fast and the club is setting, then I can actually generate that little stretch shorten, that rubber band stretch in the wrist. And if I look at wherever the blue line is on top of the club line, which is this brown one in the kinematic sequence, if I look at any time the arm is traveling faster than the club, you can think of it as in another rubber band that's stretching. And if I look at Jon, there's a lot of space where the arm is traveling faster than the club, which means he loads his wrist joint a lot. So if I look at Jon, if I were to rate power parts in his body, his wrist is number 1. His core is number 2 and his shoulder is number 3. So people ask, well, how does Jon create all this power? Well, number 1, he creates equal amount of separation between the upper body and lower body, if not more than most PGA Tour players. But number 2 is he has an incredible ability to load the wrist joint, let's call it, or load the shaft of the club. So there's a lot of power coming from that strong upper body. And Jon is a big guy. He's a big kid. He's always been really big. He's not the most flexible guy in the world. So if you think about it from a physical standpoint, guys who have a hard time, like Jon has a hard time doing a full deep squat, something he works on, but because he's tight, if he actually took a big swing, he'd actually lose posture. So he does something really smart. He stays inside his physical limitations. He's got a short, tight swing, but creates the loads in the separation, maximizes the core and the wrist load, and that's where Jon gets all this power. I hope that gives you a little insight on what some of the best players in the world are doing. It's definitely helped Jon become one of the best in the world, and I'm hoping to see some great stuff from Jon here in the future.